The Hidden Guest, a chilling cabin encounter. Late in October, my girlfriend Emma and I set off on a road trip to the quiet town of White River Junction in Vermont. We had rented a cozy little cabin nestled in the woods, just outside of town, through a site called Glamping Stays. The draw of the trip was to witness the fall foliage in full display, and White River Junction seemed like the perfect spot. We had the place booked from Thursday night to Sunday morning. The cabin sat on a picturesque hilltop, offering sweeping views of the surrounding forest, which was ablaze with autumn colors. When we arrived, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the trees, giving the place an almost dreamlike glow. The cabin had a digital lock system, and the owner had texted me the code earlier that day. I entered it with ease, and we stepped inside, immediately met by the warm, woody scent of a well-maintained country home. Everything inside was rustic and cozy. Wooden floors, walls, and ceilings gave the cabin a snug, welcoming atmosphere. It had an old-fashioned charm that we both adored. The layout was simple: a bathroom, a small but functional kitchen, 3 bedrooms, and a living room with a stone fireplace. For just the two of us, it was more space than we needed. There were 2 TVs, one in the living room and one in the master bedroom. One door, however, was locked, and though we assumed it was a storage closet or an unused bedroom, it sparked a bit of curiosity. Emma joked that maybe the owner kept a skeleton in there. I chuckled, but the locked door didn't bother us much at the time. We unpacked and placed most of our luggage in the second bedroom, deciding to keep the master bedroom tidy. That night, we grabbed dinner at a local bistro, walked around the small, quiet village, and then returned to the cabin to watch a movie. By the time we finished, it was late, and we turned in for the night. The next day greeted us with a brisk, cloudy morning. It was perfect for hiking, so we laced up our boots and set off to explore some nearby trails that ran through the forest around the cabin. The woods were serene, the only sounds being the crunch of leaves beneath our feet and the occasional rustle of wildlife in the underbrush. It was the kind of peaceful escape we had been craving. Back at the cabin, I showered while Emma relaxed in the living room. When I emerged, fresh and warm, she mentioned hearing something odd earlier. It sounded like a faint radio, she said, coming from the locked room. "That's strange," I said, stepping toward the door. I pressed my ear against the wood, but it was silent. "Maybe it's nothing," Emma muttered, her brow furrowed with concern. I knocked on the door lightly, just to mess with her. She scolded me for it, saying it freaked her out, but I laughed it off. After all, what could possibly be in there? Later, while Emma took her shower, I relaxed in the living room, flipping through channels on the TV. That's when I thought I heard it again. Faint, distorted voices coming from the locked room. I muted the television and walked over to the door. This time, the sound was unmistakable, like soft murmuring or a radio playing just out of range. Chills ran down my spine. I grabbed my phone and messaged the host, explaining the situation. He responded fairly quickly, saying that he wasn't sure why the door was locked, but it might be something his wife had done. As for the noises, he said he had no idea. Maybe his wife left an old radio on, he suggested, but he offered to come by and check it out. When Emma emerged from the shower, I chose not to mention what I'd heard again, hoping to keep her from worrying. We went out for lunch at a nearby restaurant, followed by a scenic drive around town. By then, it was around 4 p.m., and we decided to return to the cabin. As soon as we arrived, I noticed something odd. The door to the cabin was slightly ajar. Emma hadn't noticed, but it set me on edge immediately. I grabbed her arm. "Did you close the door when we left?" I asked. "Of course," she replied, looking back toward the cabin. We entered cautiously, but everything seemed undisturbed, except for a subtle, sickly sweet odor that wasn't there before. It was almost like rotting fruit, just faint enough to be unsettling. Emma collapsed on the couch, exhausted from the day's activities, while I made an excuse to step outside. A thought occurred to me. Why hadn't I looked through the window of the locked room earlier? I crept around the side of the cabin, heart pounding. The window was uncurtained, and as I stood on my toes to peek in, my blood turned to ice. Inside the room, barely illuminated by a dim light, stood a gaunt figure, a tall, emaciated man, swaying gently in the center of the room. His face was hidden by a hood, and he clutched a small portable radio, the source of the faint voices we'd been hearing. He turned to face me, and I saw his smile, thin, stretched, grotesque. He lifted a hand and waved slowly, as if mocking me. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over myself as I rushed toward the cabin. I burst through the door, yelling for Emma to get up. She was startled and confused, but the fear in my voice was enough to get her moving. "We need to leave. Now!" I shouted, grabbing our bags and shoving them into the car. Emma followed, still trying to comprehend what was happening. We sped away from the cabin, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I called the host again and told him everything. He promised to call the police immediately. We didn't stop driving until we were back in the center of town. About an hour later, the host called back. The police had arrived and searched the cabin. The locked door had been opened, but the man was gone. They found evidence that someone had been living there: food wrappers, empty bottles, and a filthy sleeping bag under the bed. Whoever he was, he had been there the entire time we were staying, hiding just behind that locked door. We stayed in a nearby motel for the rest of the weekend, though neither of us slept well. The thought that someone had been watching us, so close while we slept, left a permanent scar on both of us. The cabin had seemed like the perfect getaway, but it had turned into a waking nightmare, one I wouldn't forget for as long as I lived. The host refunded us, and we made arrangements to leave early. I couldn't shake the memory of that smiling man, his hollow eyes fixed on me through the window. Title: The Girl at the End of the Road. It was a rainy October evening when I left the hospital after my 12-hour shift. I didn't have any plans for Halloween that night, but my friend Alex had invited me to his party, and I felt guilty about skipping it. I didn't even have a costume, just my hospital scrubs. I stopped at a convenience store, grabbed some drinks to contribute, and made my way to the party. When I arrived, the small house was packed. There were probably 30 people there, most of them dressed up in costumes. I spotted Alex near the back, dressed as some kind of zombie nurse. He waved me over, but after a quick greeting, I found myself just standing awkwardly by the kitchen counter, nursing a drink. The noise and the crowd were overwhelming after such a long day. I was already tired, and the last thing I wanted was to socialize with people I didn't know. After about an hour, I decided I'd had enough. I didn't want to stick around just to be polite. I pulled an Irish goodbye, slipping out the back door and heading to my car parked a block away. As I reached the Subaru, the rain started coming down harder. I hopped into the driver's seat, started the engine, and set off. I left the music off, enjoying the sound of the rain hitting the windshield, and just wanted to get home. As I drove through the quiet, dark residential streets, something caught my eye. A girl was walking on the side of the road, drenched from head to toe. She had no umbrella, no jacket, just a simple white dress that clung to her skin in the rain. My gut instinct told me to keep driving, but something else, a strange pull, made me stop. I rolled down the window and called out to her. "Hey, do you need a ride?" She didn't respond, just turned her head and stared at me with big, dark eyes. Without a word, she walked over and opened the back door, sliding into the seat behind me. There was something unsettling about her silence, but I brushed it off. Maybe she was just shy or cold. "Where are you headed?" I asked, looking at her in the rearview mirror. "Just down to the end of the road," she replied in a low, soft voice. I nodded and started driving again, feeling an odd sense of discomfort creeping in. The rain seemed to intensify as we moved down the empty street. I glanced at the mirror again, but her face was obscured by the shadows in the back seat. I tried to make conversation, asking her what she was doing out in the rain, but she didn't answer. She just stared out the window. As we neared the end of the road, I noticed something strange. The road didn't just end, it led straight into a dense forest, and beyond that, there was nothing but darkness. No houses, no lights, just trees and the feeling of isolation. I slowed the car, looking back at her through the mirror. "This is the end of the road. Is this where you wanted to go?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm, but a cold sweat had already broken out on the back of my neck. She didn't reply. I turned around in my seat to face her directly, but she wasn't there. The back seat was empty. My heart jumped into my throat. I hadn't heard the door open, hadn't heard her get out. There was no way she could have left without me noticing. I slammed on the brakes and jumped out of the car, frantically checking the back seat. It was dry, completely dry. There was no sign that anyone had been sitting there, despite the fact that she had been soaked. I scanned the area, but there was no one in sight, just rain and darkness. And then in the distance, I noticed something, a figure standing at the edge of the woods. It was her, the girl in the white dress. She was standing motionless, staring at me from the tree line. "Hey!" I shouted, but she didn't move. She just stood there, her face still and pale in the dim light from the street lamp. I don't know why, but something about the way she stared at me made every hair on my body stand on end. There was no life in her eyes. It was as though she wasn't really human. I took a step back toward my car, my heart racing. I could feel her gaze boring into me, even as I turned away. I got back in the car, slammed the door, and drove off, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. I didn't look back, afraid of what I might see. The rain continued to pour, blurring my vision, but I kept my eyes on the road, determined to get home as quickly as possible. When I finally reached my apartment, I rushed inside, locking the door behind me. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Who was that girl? How had she vanished from my car? Why had she appeared at the edge of the forest? I spent the rest of the night tossing and turning, unable to shake the image of her pale face and hollow eyes. The next morning, I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that I had been exhausted, maybe even hallucinating. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. That girl hadn't been real, at least not in the way I understood. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about her. I avoided driving past that area, taking different routes to work, but the thought of her still lingered in the back of my mind. One night, out of curiosity and desperation, I searched online for any information about that road or the nearby forest. What I found chilled me to the bone. Years ago, a young woman named Lucy had disappeared in that very area. She had been walking home late at night, but she never made it. Her body was found weeks later, deep in the woods, her white dress still intact. They never caught the person responsible for her death, and her case had gone cold. But there were rumors, stories of a ghostly figure wandering the roads on rainy nights, looking for a ride to the place where she had died. My blood ran cold as I read through the accounts. It all matched. The dress, the road, the rain. I had picked up a ghost. There was no other explanation. I couldn't shake the feeling that she had chosen me for a reason, that somehow I had become part of her story. From that day on, I avoided that road at all costs. But even now, every time it rains, I can't help but glance in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see her sitting there, waiting to be taken back to the end of the road.